Hello! If you visited before, thanks for coming back. If you're new here, welcome. Please check out my channel intro to get acquainted. This is the second video in my series on HACCP. You can find the whole playlist down in the description below. I suggest watching them in order because each video does build off of the previous. My name is Pierre-Antoine and I am your guide on this HACCP journey. In the last video, we talked about how we have to have our prerequisites in place before we can start applying the 7 principles of HACCP. As a reminder, these 7 principles are hazard analysis, identification of critical control points, establishment of critical limits, monitoring procedures, corrective action, record keeping, and verification procedure. Today, we're going to start applying these principles. But before we can start, there's actually one last thing to do, and that's establishing our process flow. Process flow simply refers to the steps required to make each of your final products. Typically, process flows are linked to a specific production line or process, so you may have more than one process flow depending on your operation. To figure out what your process flow is, you need to figure out what each step is within your production process. Try to be as detailed as possible. Weighing, mixing, baking, cooling, packaging are all different steps. And there's a great chance your process has a lot more than these steps. Any waste or rework or introduction of air or water has to be considered in the process flow. Now the question is, what's the best way to document a process flow? Well, typically it's a diagram. Here's an example of what a process flow diagram would look like. The diagram should indicate every step taken as your product makes its way from ingredients to finished product, using arrows to indicate the way the process flows. The first step in the diagram should always be receiving, because your product starts with ingredients, and the last should be distribution or final storage. Now that we understand what each step is in all of our processes, thanks to our process flow diagrams, we can start assessing risks for each of these steps. Risk assessment starts by applying the first principle of HACCP, hazard analysis. Hazards are agents that are reasonably likely to cause illness or injury in absence of their control. In other words, hazards are the things that could hurt your customers if you don't identify and control them. There are 3 primary hazard categories: biological, chemical, and physical. And you'll need to consider each of these categories independently within each of your steps. Biological hazards primarily stem from ingredients, storage, employee handling, and contaminated air or water. Chemical hazards are primarily due to residues left after cleaning or leaks. Keep in mind that some food additives also fall in the chemical hazard categories because they're dangerous at high concentrations, like nitrites or antimicrobial agents. Physical hazards can include poorly maintained or worn out equipment, which can cause things like lubricant or metal to fall into your production line, or hair, glass, or sand. Obviously, the risk for the consumer is a lot higher with a piece of glass than with a hair, but you don't want either in your product. The hazards at every step will vary greatly because the conditions vary greatly from step to step. Some examples of questions that you can ask at each step are: will the step involve handling by employees? Are different machines used in this step versus other steps? Are the temperatures required at one step very different from the temperatures required at another step? Do we use different chemicals to clean various tools? Has air or water been introduced in this step? For each step in your process, you need to analyze the hazards present within each of the 3 categories we just talked about. I'll be honest, this part is tedious, but it's necessary to apply the rest of the HACCP principles later. For each hazard, you need to establish the likelihood of the hazard happening and the level of risk that it poses to a potential consumer. Establishing these 2 characteristics of each potential hazard is necessary for the next part of our assignment, which brings us to determining which steps are critical control points, and how to handle all of the risk outside of critical control points. A critical control point is a step at which control can be applied and is essential to prevent or eliminate a food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. Critical control points are usually referred to as CCP for short. There are a couple of common ways to use your hazard information to determine your critical control points, either a risk assessment matrix or a decision tree. Personally, I like to use a risk assessment matrix because it doesn't require any calculation and it's quick and easy to use. Here's the risk assessment matrix I use. The matrix determines that anything above a certain threshold will be considered a critical control point. When looking at the matrix, consider one hazard and evaluate the risk it poses if not managed. For example, let's consider a packaging step and the hazard be employees not washing their hands and handling the product with unsanitary hands. This is a biological hazard, and the risk it poses probably can cause serious illness in consumers, which is our fourth row of risk. Next, for the same hazard, you'll check the likelihood of it happening. For our example, let's say you have a serious hand washing policy as well as a glove wearing policy that applies to all who handle packaging. The likelihood of dirty hands handling product are thus small, but definitely not impossible, so you'll see what column that corresponds to. Finally, match your row and your column, and you'll see a color indicator. That will tell you what to do with that hazard. If it's red, then it will be a critical control point. I made this matrix available to download on our website. You'll find a link to that in the description. All the potential hazards that don't come out of this exercise as critical still pose a risk that has to be managed. You'll need to decide and document how you handle each of these risks. Usually one of your prerequisite programs will address them, but you may find other cases where you need to find other methods of mitigation. For our example of unclean hands at packaging, you could refer to your hand washing policy, your glove policy, and maybe a checklist that supervisors fill that when they check for hand washing and glove wearing daily. Once you've done this for every step of each of your production processes, you've applied the first two principles of HACCP, hazard analysis and identification of critical control points. The good news is this is a big chunk of the HACCP legwork. Next, we'll learn how to integrate the next two principles of HACCP, establishing critical limits and monitoring your CCPs. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.